I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there in the middle of my sister's bridal suite, holding a small wooden box with my name carved into the lid, and I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because after 31 years of feeling like a stranger in my own family, I finally understood why. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old. I teach second grade at an elementary school in a small town in Ohio, and for most of my life, I believed that being ordinary was my greatest sin. My mother made sure I knew it. Not with bruises or screaming, nothing so obvious. She did it quietly, the way you'd lower the temperature in a room 1 degree at a time until one day you wake up and you're just cold and you can't remember when it started. My sister Melissa is 27. She was always the sun in our house. Bright, loud, effortlessly loved. She got the bigger bedroom, the car on her 16th birthday, the graduation party that lasted all weekend. I got card and a $20 bill tucked inside it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that a lot. My father, the man I called my father, is a quiet man named Dennis. He works in insurance. He coaches youth baseball on weekends. He never once in my life told me he loved me. But I watched him tell Melissa at least 100 times. He'd ruffle her hair, pull her into a side hug, say it the way people say good morning, automatically, without thought. When I walked into a room, he'd look up from his newspaper, nod, and look back down. I used to think I was imagining the difference. I spent years trying to prove to myself that it was all in my head. It wasn't. My mother's name is Patricia, but everyone calls her Patty. She has perfect nails and a perfect lawn, and she volunteers at the church bake sale every single year without fail. She is the kind of woman who brings a casserole when someone dies and smiles at everyone in the grocery store. She is also the kind of woman who told me, 2 weeks before my sister's wedding, that she needed my bridesmaid dress returned because they were changing the lineup. She said it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. I had driven 40 minutes to have dinner with the family, the way I did every few weeks because I kept believing that if I just showed up enough, something would eventually shift. She set a plate in front of me, and then while she was putting the serving spoon back in the mashed potatoes, she said it. Casually, like she was mentioning the weather. We're simplifying the wedding party. Melissa wants it to be more intimate, you understand. I looked at my father. He was cutting his chicken. I looked at Melissa. She was on her phone. I said, I'm her sister. My mother said, you'll still be a guest. You'll have a lovely seat. I drove home that night and I sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a long time. I didn't cry. I just sat there thinking about all the times I'd told myself it was in my head. The wedding was 6 weeks away. I had already bought the dress. I called my Aunt Ruth the next morning. Aunt Ruth is my father's older sister. She lives 40 minutes north, in the same house she's lived in for 40 years, surrounded by plants she's named and books she's read twice. She's the only person in my family who ever made me feel like I made sense. When I was little and my mother forgot to pick me up, practice, twice, it was Aunt Ruth who came. When I graduated college and my parents left the reception early because Melissa had a volleyball tournament, it was Aunt Ruth who stayed until they turned the lights off. She answered on the second ring. I told her what my mother had said. There was a long pause. Come over Saturday, she said. I need to show you something. She didn't explain more than that. She just said it the way you'd say brace yourself without using those words. I spent the rest of the week teaching long division and reading picture books aloud and pretending that the thing sitting in my chest wasn't getting heavier. My students drew me a mural on Friday because it was my work anniversary at the school. They spelled my name wrong, Clara, and it was the most loved I'd felt all week. Saturday morning I drove to Aunt Ruth's house. She met me at the door before I could knock. She looked tired in a way that was different from regular tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying a decision for a very long time and had finally decided to put it down. She made coffee. We sat at her kitchen table, and then she got up and went into the back room and came out carrying a shoebox. Not the wooden box, that came later. This was a plain shoebox, the kind you keep receipts in. She set it on the table between us and put both her hands flat on top of it and looked at me. I should have done this years ago, she said. I want you to know that I know that. I didn't say anything. She opened the box. Inside were photographs. Old ones with that particular color that photos from the early 90s get, slightly washed out, like a memory that's been handled too many times. There was a woman in most of them, young, dark-haired, laughing in several. In a few of the photos, she was with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, light-eyed, the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily. "Who is this?" I asked. Aunt Ruth pointed to the woman. "That is your mother." I looked at her. I looked at the photo. The woman in the photo looked nothing like Patricia. "That's not my mom," I said. "No," Aunt Ruth said quietly. "It's not. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I handled it with grace. The truth is, I put the photograph down very carefully, like it was something fragile, and then I just looked out the window at Aunt Ruth's bird feeder for about 30 seconds because I needed somewhere to put my eyes. Aunt Ruth told me everything. My father, Dennis, had a younger brother named Thomas. Thomas was the kind of person who burned brightly and briefly. He was charming and restless, and he made bad decisions with a smile on his face. In 1993, Thomas fell in love with a woman named Diane. She was 23. She worked at a diner and she painted in her spare time, and according to Aunt Ruth, she was the most genuinely warm person Thomas had ever brought home. Diane got pregnant. Thomas panicked. That's the word Aunt Ruth used. Panicked. He wasn't ready. He wasn't stable. He told Diane he needed time, and then he took more time than he said he would. And in that gap, Patricia happened. Patricia had been dating Dennis for 2 years. Dennis was steady and responsible, the safe choice, and Patricia had always been good at identifying the safe choice. When she found out about Diane and the pregnancy, she didn't run. She did something that to this day I can barely make myself understand. She went to Diane. She told her that Thomas wasn't coming back. She told her that she and Dennis would take the baby. She told her it was the best thing for everyone. And Diane, who was alone and 23 and frightened, believed her. I was born in April of 1994. Diane signed the papers. Thomas never knew she'd agreed to anything. He came back 3 months later, ready to try, and was told by Patricia that Diane had given the baby up and moved away. He believed it because he'd given Patricia no reason to lie to him, and people who feel guilty often accept the story that costs them the least. Dennis knew. He had agreed to the arrangement. He and Patricia had just gotten engaged, and she had come to him with a plan, and he had gone along with it the way he went along with most of Patricia's plans, quietly, with his hands folded. Thomas died in a car accident in 2003. I was 9. I remembered going to the funeral and not understanding why I cried so hard for an uncle I barely knew. Diane was still alive. Aunt Ruth knew because she had kept track, quietly at a distance, for 31 years. She had never told anyone. She had told herself it wasn't her secret to share. But she had also, she told me, kept photographs. She had kept a letter. She reached back into the shoebox and handed it to me. It was sealed, with my name on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Aunt Ruth said Diane had sent it to her 8 years ago, not knowing if it would ever reach me, just needing somewhere to put it. I held that envelope for a long time before I opened it. Diane had written 6 pages by hand. Her handwriting was small and even, and she apologized in the first paragraph, and then made herself stop apologizing, because she said she'd been told that leading with guilt is a way of making someone else manage your feelings. She said a therapist told her that, and she'd thought about it for years. She told me about herself. She said she still painted. She said she'd had a good life, that she had married a kind man named Robert when I was 7, and they had 2 children together, a son named Eli, and a daughter named Josephine. She said not a single year had passed without her thinking about me. She said she had driven past the elementary school in the town where she knew I was living. She didn't say how she knew, and she had sat in her car for an hour hoping to see me come out. And when she finally did, she had been so overwhelmed that she drove away without getting out. She said she didn't want to disrupt my life. She said she just needed me to know that I had been wanted, that she had not let me go lightly, that she had made a decision at 23 that she had never stopped grieving. She left a phone number at the bottom of the page. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I looked at Aunt Ruth, who had been sitting quietly across from me with her coffee going cold. "How long have you had this?" I asked. 8 years, she said. She didn't look away when she said it. "Why now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because they took you out of that wedding, and I decided I was done protecting people who don't deserve it." I drove home in a kind of stillness that I don't have a good word for. Not numb. More like the feeling after a storm when the air is different, when everything is the same, but the quality of the light has changed. I called in a favor with a friend who works in county records. It took 4 days. When the documents came through, the original birth certificate listed my mother as Deanne Calloway and my father as Thomas Gerald Whitmore. Dennis's name was not on it. Patricia's name was not on it. The amended certificate, filed when I was 4 months old, was the one that replaced it. The one I had grown up with. The legal one that said I belonged to a family I had always felt borrowed from. I did not call Patricia. I did not call Dennis. I sat with what I knew for 2 weeks, going to work and reading to my second graders, and letting them show me their drawings of dogs. And at night, I took out Diane's letter and read it again, 1 page at a time. On a Wednesday night, I called the number at the bottom of the letter. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said, "This is Clara." There was a sound on the other end of the line that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a breath, quick, like something she'd been holding for 31 years and had finally been allowed to release. We talked for 2.5 hours. I learned that Eli is 26 and works in construction, and that he already knew about me, that Diane had told both her children years ago. Josephine is 23 and studying nursing and had apparently said more than once that she hoped I'd call someday. Robert, Diane's husband, had gone to the other room to give us space, but had knocked on the door at the 1-hour mark to ask if Diane needed anything, and Diane had laughed and said she was fine. And that laugh, the ease of it, the warmth of it, told me more about her life than anything else could have. She didn't push. She didn't ask for anything. She told me her address and said I could come whenever I was ready, or never come at all, and that she would be grateful either way, just for the call. She said she didn't need me to fill any particular role. She said she just wanted me to know the door was open. I said I would come. I said maybe in a few weeks. She said, "I'll make sure there's a seat for you at the table." I had to set the phone down for a moment after that. Melissa's wedding was 2 Saturdays later. I went. I wore a blue dress I bought specifically for the occasion, not the bridesmaid dress, which I had returned without saying anything. I sat 3 rows back. My parents were at the front. My mother glanced at me once when she was walking in, and her expression did something complicated that she smoothed over quickly. The ceremony was lovely, I mean that genuinely. Melissa was radiant. Her husband, a man named Greg who coaches high school football and cries at nature documentaries, looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. I was glad for her. Whatever my family had done to me, Melissa had not done it, and I had decided on the drive over that I would let myself just be happy for her, at least for the length of the ceremony. At the reception, I found a seat at a table near the back. My father came over. He stood next to my chair for a moment, his hands in his pockets, and he said, "You look nice." I said, "Thank you." He stood there another moment, and then he said quietly, so no one nearby could hear, "Your mother told me about the bridesmaid thing. I want you to know I didn't." And then he stopped. I looked at him. I waited. He didn't finish the sentence. He nodded once, the way he always did, and walked back toward the front table. I thought about everything I could have said. I thought about the birth certificate in my bag. I thought about Diane's letter and the sound of her voice on the phone, and the 2.5 hours we'd spent learning each other in real time. I thought about Aunt Ruth sitting with a shoebox for 8 years and finally deciding to put it down. I didn't say anything to my father. Not yet. Not there, at his other daughter's wedding, with a band setting up in the corner and caterers moving between tables. Some conversations need the right room. But I did send a text that night, after I got home and fed my cat and sat on the couch in the quiet. I sent it to my father, just a few sentences. I told him I had found the original birth certificate. I told him I had spoken with Diane. I told him I wasn't angry, not in the explosive way, but that I needed him to understand that I had spent 31 years being made to feel like I didn't belong anywhere, and that now I knew why, and that I needed time. He read it. I could see the read receipt. He didn't reply that night. 3 days later, he called. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, and I listened to it twice. He cried. I had never heard my father cry before. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself for years that what Patricia had done, what they had done, was giving me stability, a good home, a family. He said he had known, somewhere, that he was compensating with distance, because he didn't know how to be close to me the way he was with Melissa, without feeling like he was betraying Diane's sacrifice. He said none of that made it right. He said he understood if I didn't want to speak to him for a long time. I listened to that message, standing in my kitchen in the morning light, and I thought, you should have said this 20 years ago. But also you said it now. I haven't called him back yet. I'm not ready. But I haven't deleted the voicemail either. My mother has not reached out. 6 weeks after the wedding, on a Sunday afternoon in October, I drove north for 2.5 hours to a small house outside Columbus, with a flower box in the front window and a welcome mat that was slightly crooked. I sat in the car for a few minutes, not from fear, but because I wanted to be present for it. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be on the right side of a door I'd been kept outside of for my entire life. Diane opened the door before I knocked. She had seen me pull in. She was shorter than I expected, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and she was wearing a paint-stained flannel shirt, and when she saw me she put one hand over her mouth and just stood there for a moment. Josephine appeared behind her and said, with the energy of someone who had been waiting all day, "Mom, let her come in." Eli was in the kitchen, pretending to be very busy with something on the counter, but he turned when I came in and said, "Hey," in the easy way of someone who had already decided to like me, and then immediately offered me something to eat, because apparently that's his response to any situation. Robert shook my hand. He had a firm handshake and kind eyes, and he said simply, "We're glad you came." We sat at the kitchen table. There was coffee and a plate of things Diane had clearly spent time making. The light came through the window at a low autumn angle and fell across the table and across the faces of these strangers who had my jaw and my way of holding a coffee cup, and this specific, particular laugh that I heard Josephine do at some point and recognized immediately because it was mine. We talked for 4 hours. When I left that evening, Diane walked me to my car. The air was cold and clean and the sky had gone the deep blue that comes just before full dark. She hugged me at the car door, and she held on for a moment longer than a polite hug, and when she pulled back she said, "You don't have to forgive anyone. You don't have to figure everything out right now. You just have to come back whenever you want." I told her I would. I drove home with the window cracked and the radio low, and somewhere around the halfway point I started crying. Not from sadness, not from grief exactly, but from the particular relief of something that has been out of place for a very long time, finally finding where it belongs. My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old. I teach 2nd grade, and my students can't always spell my name right, and for most of my life I felt like a person who had been placed in the wrong story. It turns out I was. But I found the right one. And there was a seat for me at the table. There always had been. It was just in a different house than the one I'd been told to call home. I've been thinking about what it actually means to belong somewhere. Not the legal version of it. Not the version written on an amended certificate filed when you're 4 months old and have no say in anything. The real version. The kind you feel in your body when you walk into a room and the people in it are genuinely glad you came. For most of my life, I thought belonging was something you earned. I showed up to every dinner. I drove 40 minutes each way. I kept my voice steady when my mother said things that should have broken me. I told myself that if I just tried hard enough, if I was patient enough, if I asked for little enough, eventually the distance would close. It didn't. And I think now I understand why. You cannot earn your way into a place that was never honestly offered to you. The effort was real. The welcome wasn't. What Patricia did, what Dennis agreed to, wasn't just a decision made in 1993. It was a decision remade every single day for 31 years. Every time they looked at me and chose silence over truth. There is a kind of harm that doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It lives in the nod instead of the hug, in the missing seat, in the birthday card with a $20 bill and nothing written inside. The people who do this kind of harm often believe they are not doing harm at all. They have convinced themselves that the arrangement was practical, even kind, but the child on the other end of that arrangement doesn't experience it as kindness. She experiences it as a persistent, unnameable wrongness. A feeling that she is somehow failing at something she was never given instructions for. That wrongness, I now know, was information. It was true. It was telling me something real about my situation, and the fact that I couldn't explain it didn't mean it wasn't there. What I keep coming back to is Diane, a 23-year-old woman, alone and frightened, who made a decision she spent the next 3 decades grieving, and who, when given the chance, did not lead with what she needed. She led with what I needed. She wrote 6 pages by hand and apologized once, and then stopped herself, because she understood that her guilt was not something I should have to carry. That is not a small thing. That is a person who, despite everything, chose to put someone else's comfort before her own relief. That quality, that particular form of earned wisdom, is not something that appears without cost. It comes from years of sitting with a choice you cannot undo, and deciding, slowly, to become someone who deserves the outcome she's hoping for. And I think that is what I want to carry forward from all of this. Not the anger, though the anger is legitimate and I'm not pretending otherwise. Not the grief, though that's real too. What I want to carry is this, the understanding that integrity is not what you do when it's easy. It's what you do when the truth is inconvenient, when telling it costs you something, when staying silent would be so much simpler. Aunt Ruth held a shoebox for 8 years. She got it wrong for a long time. But she put it down when it mattered. That counts. Dennis left a voicemail that lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and said the word sorry to a daughter he had spent 31 years keeping at arm's length. That is not nothing. It is late, and it is insufficient. And it is also the first honest thing he has ever offered me. I don't know yet what I will do with it. But I know this, I drove 2.5 hours and knocked on a door, and on the other side of it was a table with a seat that had always been mine. Sometimes the life that was meant for you is not the one you were handed. Sometimes you have to lose the wrong thing completely before you can find your way to the right one. My name is Clara. And for the first time in 31 years, I know exactly where I belong,